Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Nick Miles, and at 14 hours GMT on the 10th of November, these are our main stories. Afghanistan's former finance minister says corruption fatally undermined his government and the army, leading to the Taliban takeover.
The whole feeling was, we cannot change this. Everybody would say, the stream is murky from the very top, meaning the very top is involved.
The UN has released the first draft of a potential agreement at the COP26 climate summit.
If you lose the momentum that's being created by good people at Glasgow trying to do their best and wait for another year or 2 years, I don't think we'll get there.
So will any agreement live up to that? And should Donald Trump be worried the Capitol riot investigators will be allowed to see his presidential documents? And
Germany's anti-vaxxers are on furious form.
the anti-vax lobby is alive and growing in Germany. And life on Mars? How about ketchup on Mars? How tomato sauce is getting involved in the space race. When international troops began to leave Afghanistan earlier this year, there were warnings that the Taliban would take the opportunity to launch an offensive. But the speed at which the militant group captured the country came as quite a shock, given that the Afghan government officially had 300,000 troops to defend against a Taliban force of up to 70,000 fighters. Now, though, in his first broadcast interview since the Taliban took over, the man who was finance minister at the time says those figures were not accurate. Speaking to the BBC's Ed Butler, Khalid Payenda blamed widespread corruption in government for Kabul's fall.
My assumption is we never had 300,000 forces. The way the accountability was done, you would ask the chief in that province, how many people you have. And, based on that, you would calculate salaries and ration expenses. And they would always be inflated.
Right. I mean, what you were quoted as saying is there were maybe 40 to 50,000 troops, not 300,000. And the rest were just ghosts, you said.
Ghosts, desertions, martyrs who were never accounted for because some of the commanders would keep their bank cards for salaries to withdraw.
So soldiers would die in the field and their generals, their commanders, would just claim their salaries even after they were dead?
Absolutely. Even when you had soldiers, they were not paid on time. They would be also double dipping, the same people would get paid by the government, but they would also go to Taliban or surrender and then make a deal with them and get paid again.
You're describing governors corrupt, MPs corrupt, generals taking payoffs so that they just flee abroad as soon as the Taliban start to advance. It's like Afghanistan never stood a chance.
Yes, unfortunately, so was the case. The whole feeling was, we cannot change this. This is how the parliament works. This is how the governors work. Everybody would say, the stream is murky from the very top, meaning the very top is involved.
Where was the president in all this?
With him, his management style, he wanted to lead everything himself, and sometimes that did not help. He was all over the place, and there was so much propaganda around him that he started mistrusting everybody, But I don't believe he was financially corrupt.
He blamed you, though, for some of the failures of the finance ministry, didn't he?
Yes, his blame that, Ministry of Finance is corrupt. I agree with that to a certain extent, but in these issues, absolutely not true.
How do you look back on the 20 years of NATO-backed Western-style government in Afghanistan?
I think it was a great opportunity lost, and unfortunately, who lost the most are the common Afghans. They are worse than they were in pre-9/11 era.
Do you blame the West for some of those failures?
Oh, absolutely. Some of the corruption, some of the mismanagement, some of the waste, they were part of it.
That was Khalid Payenda speaking to Ed Butler. The first draft of an agreement has been published at the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow. The aspirations of the teams from the 200 nations attending are now out there in the public domain. What lies ahead are days of negotiations, rewrites and tweaks to an agreement that many say must try to keep the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. The former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, is urging delegates to make a final push to avoid the summit being branded a failure.
We've got to try in the next 72 hours to make progress. Then I would bring together ministers within the next 3 months. If you lose the momentum that's been created by good people at Glasgow trying to do their best and wait for another year or 2 years, I don't think we'll get there.
Much of the African continent is on the front line for the dangerous impact of climate change. Zahir Fakir is one of the climate negotiators for South Africa, and he leads the African group of negotiators.
The main issue is the ambition that is needed. If we're wanting to keep 1.5 alive, we need to have a realistic discussion in terms of what is the quantum of finance that's required, what is the nature of that finance, how do we get financing that does not exacerbate debt burdens and also allows developing countries the fiscal space to do the work they need.
So, how's the first draft going down in Glasgow? Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath gave us his assessment.
It's a very interesting first draft. The UK presidency has decided to go for broke. They've put down some quite ambitious targets on cutting carbon by 2030 and getting countries to up their plans to do that. They're calling for all countries to put new plans on the table by the end of next year. Countries are only obliged to do this every 5 years. But so great is the gap to keeping temperatures down this century under that 1.5 degree safe level. They want countries to come back next year with new plans. They also want an annual ministerial level meeting, and they want the Secretary General to get world leaders together in 2023. So they're really trying to push a lot on this question of cutting carbon and also phasing out subsidies and phasing out coal and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Those are things that campaigners will see as critically important.
Obviously, there's going to be lots of horse trading in the days to come. What do you think the host would see as a good compromise? Something that was mentioned a lot in the run-up to this was this idea of revisiting those commitments from countries every year. Would that be part of the key to this?
Yeah, I think it is very much part of the key to this, Nick. It's important that the UK and the countries here send a signal to the world that we're taking this seriously. The poorest countries say you should come back every year. The richer ones don't want to come back every year. And in fact, many of the poorer ones don't want to come back every year because putting together a new carbon cutting plan is a difficult and expensive exercise. So there may be some pushback on that and there may be some opposition. There's likely to be another draft of this text in the next day or so we get a clearer idea then if that is going to fly.
Reaction to this has been mixed. There was a withering response from Greenpeace. They were saying it's not a plan to solve the climate crisis. It's a polite request that countries maybe possibly do more next year. How widely felt is that, do you think, Matt?
I think that represents some opinion here. There are others who are perhaps more schooled in the ideas of horse trading and who see perhaps that if they gain on the mitigation aspect, that's the carbon cutting, they may have to give on the other things. And I think some campaigners are saying, look, it's good on 1.5, it's good on getting countries to come back, it's weak on finance and it's weak on the question of loss and damage for poorer countries. And at the moment, they seem okay with that, but they'll want to keep in the things that are important to them. But I think in the next day or so, a number of countries will get their hands on this document and then they'll be sharpening their pencils and a lot of the things that are in at the moment might find themselves dumped.
That was Matt McGrath. Well, new evidence from Africa shows just how climate change is already dramatically increasing the number of droughts and floods on the continent. Parts of South Africa are currently experiencing a devastating 7-year-long drought. But the city of Cape Town, which came close to running out of water completely 3 years ago, is finding unusual ways to cope. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reports.
It's a clear morning and I've just been dropped off by helicopter on a remote mountainside outside Cape Town. The scenery here is absolutely stunning. Huge mountains covered in pine trees. And I'm now clambering up a little further to meet a group of people who are busy with saws and with chainsaws trying to get rid of all those trees.
Primary invaders in these parts of the mountains or at this altitude would be pine trees.
Overseeing the teams here today is Nkosi Natinama, steering a huge project to clear the mountains of non-indigenous trees, of pines in particular, that are gulping up precious water supplies.
About 54 billion litres of water a year are used up by invasive alien plant species in these 7 priority subcatchments.
So water that could have gone to people in Cape Town?
That's correct, and that's about 2 to 3 months worth of water a year for Cape Town.
It makes particular sense because just 3 years ago a severe drought emptied the reservoirs and pushed Cape Town to the very brink of running out of water completely, towards what became known as Day Zero.
The Day Zero was a shock to everyone. Of course, the thought of running out of water as a city was quite tragic and very scary.
In the sprawling townships around Cape Town, where hundreds share a single water tap, activist Siyabonga Mnyeza remembers how people rallied, cutting the city's water consumption by half.
That shock was enough to facilitate the process of change and responsibility. But also I think the city really communicated quite aggressively and consistently, which then made everyone to pull together to overcome the dreaded Day Zero.
Fear works. It makes people change.
It makes people change.
But the challenges in South Africa remain huge.
Is it the worst you've ever seen?
By far. Definitely by far.
To the northeast of Cape Town, retired farmer Jay Killian flies me over a huge region that has not seen a proper rainfall for almost 7 years.
Andrew, the worst that I've seen in my lifetime. We've had droughts before, but never this bad. And if this continues, then obviously we'll end up as a desert.
But it's not just the bone-dry pasture here that's suffering. In towns and cities across the Eastern Cape, the taps are running dry. I'm following a water truck as it makes its way around this very poor township. You can hear the noise of the pump there. And desperate people all around me are running, literally running towards the truck. Every time it stops, I can see them here bringing their plastic bottles, their buckets, their old paint tins to fill up with water. There's no guarantee when the truck will be back next, and people have to last for days in between deliveries.
My name is Elsie Hans. I am 53. We can't take water because there is too much people there. We don't have water.
No water for 2 days?
No water for 2 days. I'm worried about the future because it's going to be worse and worse and worse.
It is tempting, of course, to blame all this on the drought, on climate change. But the truth is that this is about a failure to plan, a failure to build and to maintain key infrastructure here. Kuster Jack is an opposition politician in the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality, now threatened by its own Day Zero crisis.
In Cape Town, the leadership of that city, it rose to the occasion and they did everything and they were singing from the same hymn. And as a consequence of that, it helped them to overcome the problem, and doing that with the community, making it seriously conscious about the danger. And the people are, of course, they move with them on that.
And here?
Here is the other way around because, first of all, this place has been led by very mediocre kind of leadership. So whatever this leadership says, people don't believe them.
A report was by Andrew Harding. Thailand's Constitutional Court has ruled that 3 pro-democracy activists who organised demonstrations last year had wanted to overthrow the constitutional monarchy. The court ordered them, along with their networks, to stop similar events in the future. Jonathan Head is our Southeast Asia correspondent in Bangkok.
In Thailand, the monarchy is very strictly protected, most famously by the lèse-majesty law, which means you can't say anything derogatory or negative about the royal family, the people themselves. But last year, almost for the first time, a taboo was shattered by young protesters who felt that the system simply hadn't changed, couldn't accommodate the need for change, who came out and said, we have to talk about reforming the monarchy. The monarchy is very secretive. It's extremely wealthy. It takes a great deal from the public purse, and they felt that justified a discussion about its proper role. Now, there were some quite strong and derogatory things said about the king and the royal family on the stages by some people, and a great many lèse-majesty charges have been filed since then. But the actual protest leaders themselves were always careful to say, we want the monarchy to have a proper place in Thailand. We want to reform it to make its role better. They never called for its abolition publicly. Now the Constitutional Court, which is the top court in the country for ruling what you can and can't do effectively in politics, has said, well, even calling for reform, as they did, amounts to an attempt to overthrow the system. This is very serious. It means, in effect, the court, which is famous for making controversial, very conservative rulings, is saying you simply cannot discuss the monarchy at all without risk of falling foul of the Constitution, and also calling for the overthrow of the system, which is their interpretation of it, is actually a charge called treason here, and treason carries the death penalty. So although the court's ruling doesn't carry any penalties, it typically opens the possibility that these 3 top protest leaders may now be charged with treason and face the highest penalty.
Jonathan Head. Health campaigners are warning that some snacks sold as weaning or infant foods contain significant amounts of sugar that could encourage a sweet tooth from an early age. Here's our health reporter, Michelle Roberts.
Action on Sugar analysed 73 baby and toddler products on sale in UK shops. 36 of the products claimed on the pack that their sweet snacks were suitable for babies under the age of 12 months, even though sugar-sweetened food and drink should be avoided in this age group. Heinz Farley's Mini Rusks Original, for example, contain the equivalent of 2 teaspoons of sugar per serving. Organic's Banana Soft Oaty Bars, which are sweetened with apple juice concentrate, have almost as much. Heinz said it offered a range of reduced sugar products too, and was looking at ways to improve its foods. Organic said it had a no junk food policy and used natural ingredients that were listed on packs.
Michelle Roberts. Coming up, we get the latest on the Belarus-Poland border crisis. To Washington, D.C. now, where the US congressional investigation into the Capitol riot has been granted access to some of Donald Trump's White House records. The inquiry is trying to find out if the former president had prior knowledge of the assault. Our North America correspondent Peter Bowes has more.
There are some familiar names, others not so well known. A common theme is that some of them allegedly met in what has been described as a war room or command centre at a Washington hotel to try to figure out how to keep Mr. Trump in the White House. They include Michael Flynn, Mr. Trump's first national security advisor, a proponent of the former president's false election claims during that transition period. The committee is interested in him because he reportedly attended a meeting at the White House in December, during which the subject of declaring a national emergency as a route for seizing voting machines was discussed. And the subpoena also mentions TV appearance that he made at about this time, during which he talked about deploying military troops and declaring martial law to rerun the election. Perhaps the most interesting of the 6 is John Eastman, a lawyer for Mr. Trump, a former law professor, and the committee wants to hear from him about 2 memos that he wrote laying out former President Trump's options for denying the election result. And on January the 2nd, he had a meeting with some 300 state legislators. He told them it was the duty of the state legislatures to fix this egregious conduct, to make sure that they were not putting in the White House some guy that didn't get elected.
Several thousand people, amongst them young children, spent another night camped out in freezing conditions at the border between Belarus and Poland. But we're also now seeing a diplomatic row growing over the migrants. Chancellor Merkel of Germany has held a phone call with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Moscow is close to Belarus and has supported its actions at the border in the past. I asked our correspondent in Moscow, Steve Rosenberg, about that call.
They've had a long relationship over the last few years, and I think that sway, that influence is limited. I think the key question here is, does Russia consider that it benefits from what is going on now, from the crisis on the Belarusian EU border? And I think in many ways the Kremlin believes that it does benefit in several ways. Remember, keep in mind that Russia views geopolitics as a zero-sum game, right? So in other words, if your rival, if your enemy is in trouble or losing, then you believe that you're winning. That's how Russia sees things. And I think any crisis, any upheaval in the EU is viewed pretty positively in Moscow. Also, reports of 15,000 Polish soldiers on the border with Belarus, that fits perfectly into the narrative that the Kremlin has created about Russia being a besieged fortress surrounded by enemies, whether it's Europe or America or NATO, just waiting to attack. And that's the narrative that the Russian public is exposed to day in, day out. So that fits the narrative. But also, I think Putin's Russia benefits in another way from what's happening, from this migrant crisis, because the more isolated and embattled Alexander Lukashenko becomes, the more of a pariah he becomes, the more reliant he is on Moscow. And remember that Russia is pushing for deeper integration, for closer ties with Belarus. And a weak Lukashenko, that suits Vladimir Putin just fine.
Very interesting. Of course, the migrants are also reported to be going to Lithuania and Latvia, trying to get in there as well. And there too, Moscow will perhaps not be that upset that it could destabilise those nations as well.
Well, certainly people in those nations will be worried about that and possible destabilisation. We've been seeing and hearing signals of support today from Moscow for Belarus. We've seen 2 strategic bombers, Russian military planes, being put into the air to patrol Belarusian airspace. And we've heard messages of support from Russian officials, from the Russian foreign minister, from the Kremlin, for Belarus. It seems as if the message from Moscow is Russia and Belarus are on the same page here. And if you read that page, what the 2 countries are saying is this is a crisis not made in Minsk, not made in Moscow. Both Russia and Belarus blame European leaders for the crisis, going all the way back to 2015 and the migrant crisis in Europe, and they blame European leaders today for not letting these migrants into the EU, pretty much ignoring one of the key questions here. How did these civilians get into Belarus? And of course, for months, European governments have been accusing Belarus, the authorities in Minsk, of orchestrating a migrant crisis by bringing migrants into the country, by facilitating their transit through Belarus to the EU border and helping their illegal transfer across the border into the EU.
Oh, Steve Rosenberg. A leading virologist has warned that unless more is done to tackle coronavirus in Germany, another 100,000 people could die there. In recent days, Germany has recorded its highest rates of infection since the pandemic began, and doctors warn that some hospitals will soon reach capacity. Less than 70% of the population is fully vaccinated, and the country's health minister has publicly blamed soaring case numbers on those who've not yet been immunised. Our Berlin correspondent Jenny Hill has been to the state of Saxony, which has the lowest vaccine take-up in the country and the highest rate of infection.
Bodies obscured by tubes and wires, the men and women barely stir, most of them oblivious to the medics in masks and gowns, trying to keep them alive. The COVID ward in the intensive care unit of Leipzig University Hospital is filling up fast. In one bed, a young woman who's just given birth. Her baby is fine, but doctors aren't sure she'll make it. There are 18 COVID patients here. Just 4 were vaccinated.
It's very difficult to get staff motivated to treat patients now in this 4th wave.
Professor Sebastian Stehr is one of the specialists treating them.
A large part of the population still underestimate the problem, and it's hard to understand because of the high numbers of cases we had in the past. Basically, everybody should have a friend, somebody in their family that had a COVID infection in the past, and therefore should realize what the problem could be for themselves. But nevertheless, we are still seeing so many patients that are not vaccinated.
Germany's anti-vaxxers are on furious form. Several thousand demonstrated in Leipzig at the weekend. 16 million Germans over the age of 12 are still unvaccinated. This region, Saxony, has the lowest vaccine take-up in the country and the highest rate of infection. The authorities here now restrict unvaccinated people. They're banned from restaurants, cinemas, football matches.
This is discrimination, and we want to express vehemently that we do not accept this in our society.
Leif Hansen is a spokesman for Bewegung Leipzig, an anti-vax movement.
They say the vaccination is okay, I should give it to my children. Never. I have a feeling that it should never go into my body, and I will fight all I can to prevent it coming into my body. This is the border. No.
The German government admits it's unlikely now to persuade these people to accept a vaccine, but it has a bigger problem: how to stop the voice of dissent growing into real social division.
Because what many fear is another lockdown. Nadine Herzog's bar barely survived the last one. She deftly prepares cocktails as she tells us that even before the authorities required it, she'd banned unvaccinated drinkers.
My business was dying. My dreams came true, and now they suffer from people who don't do logical things to prevent others from getting ill or die. And I'm so angry.
There were long queues yesterday outside a walk-in vaccination centre in the city. Evidence, perhaps, that some have changed their minds, though Germany's rolling out the booster jab too, nervous about waning protection. But on the ward, they fear the damage is done. Operations have been cancelled, procedures postponed to make way for COVID patients. Doctors here warn this wave could be the worst yet. They also told us nearly half of the people who end up here will die. For the country which invented one of the world's first COVID vaccines, that is a source of great shame.
That was Jenny Hill in Saxony. Now, it's one of the most down-to-earth products, but now tomato ketchup is making its mark in the space race. A group of scientists have teamed up with the American food company Heinz to create the first ever bottle of ketchup in similar conditions to the ones you would find on Mars. Andrew Palmer works at the Aldrin Space Institute.
So the average temperature on Mars is about minus 60 degrees Celsius. It's mostly a carbon dioxide atmosphere. So we created an artificial facility where we could control the temperature and humidity, the lighting conditions. And in fact, the tomatoes that we ultimately supplied to Heinz had never seen the light of day. And the real story here is about the soil itself, right? So the soil on Mars we actually call regolith, and that's because it's devoid of any organic matter. It's not been shaped by biological processes, right? Meanwhile, the soil on our planet is, filled with organic materials. And so what we've taken is material from places here on Earth that are like places on Mars or on the moon, very nitrogen poor, so they're not filled with a lot of organic material, and they're going to be more mineralogically accurate and closer to Mars. And so by learning how to grow in that and the challenges associated with that, we learn a little bit about how we're going to grow on Mars to support a future Martian colony, but also about how to grow in these nutrient-poor areas here on the planet as well. We're beginning to grow a larger and larger palette. So, my lab and other groups have experimented with lettuces. We've seen potatoes, cucumbers, but this is the first effort to do a large-scale production of this, where we were actually able to make something in a significant enough yield that we could actually turn it over to be made as product with our partners at Heinz.
Andrew Palmer there. And that's all from us for now, but there will be a new edition of the Global News Podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. Today's edition was mixed by Peter Luff. The producer is Charlotte Gallagher and the editor Karen Martin. I'm Nick Miles. Until next time, bye-bye.